Hi everyone. This is a summary of Richard Taylor's Cosmological Argument, which is anthologized in this book, and the argument itself was first published in 1992. So before we dive in, let me say a few things about cosmological arguments in general. The cosmological argument for the existence of God comes in many different forms, but what they all have in common is that they concern themselves with the question, why something rather than nothing exists. Now, Richard Taylor's argument in particular is based upon the principle of sufficient reason, which is an idea that was coined by the philosopher Leibniz in the 17th century, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, Richard Taylor's particular version of the argument is really interesting because he starts us off walking through the woods and encountering a large translucent ball about the size of each one of us. And so we're surprised, and I think you agree, you'd be surprised if you encountered such an object in the woods, and you'd expect for some kind of explanation for how it got there. He says, however, we're only surprised in this case because, well, we're just not accustomed to encountering such things in the woods. But if you think about it, he thinks that all natural objects, whether we're talking about trees or rocks or whatever, are actually something that we would expect explanations for. And so he gives us this metaphysical principle here. He says, quote, the sheer non-existence of anything, which is not to be confused with the passing out of existence of something, never requires a reason, but existence does, end quote. So in other words, we don't take existence for granted, we actually take non-existence for granted. And this leads to the principle of sufficient reason, which says, quote, in the case of any positive truth, there is some sufficient reason for it, something that, in this sense, makes it true. In short, that there is some sort of explanation, known or unknown, for everything. Now he says there are two different kinds of truths, ones whose explanations are located in something else, and we call those contingent truths. And contingency in this case just means dependence. So things that are dependent upon something else for its existence, in this case is called a contingent truth, or we also say elsewhere a contingent being. And then there are ones whose explanations are located inside or located in themselves, and we call these necessary truths. Now, an example of a necessary truth would be something like this. He gives an example on page 92. All points of a circle are equidistant from the center. That's a necessary truth. And it's necessary because as long as we understand what the definition or the meaning of a circle is, we understand that all points on the perimeter are equidistant from the center. Now, he says the principle of sufficient reason, he doesn't give any he doesn't give any arguments for it. He just says it's a presupposition of reason. It's something that we assume. Now, some philosophers out there aren't going to be satisfied with this explanation or this argument. He just says it's an assumption of reason. In virtue of us being rational creatures, we just assume that the principle of sufficient reason is true. But enough of that. For the sake of time, let's move on to the section he calls the existence of the world. So he says it doesn't seem like the world must exist. He thinks that we can imagine the world, the whole universe, just not existing at all. And so the principle of sufficient reason requires a reason for every contingent thing in the world, but not just the things in the world, the whole world itself. To say that the world had no beginning does not satisfy the principle of sufficient reason, he says. He says, quote, but still it can be asked why there is a world, why indeed there is a beginningless world, and why there should have perhaps always been something rather than nothing. So beginningless existence, this is into the next section in the chapter, beginningless existence is not a satisfying explanation. It's not satisfying to just say something has existed for a really, really long time. That's not the question. The question isn't how long something has existed, he says. The question is why it exists at all. And so when we look at this idea of creation, moving now into the next section, the term creation he wants to redefine in terms of not something like a first cause or something occurring in time. He wants us to think about it in the terms of dependence. So he draws an analogy between the world and a beam of light. So the beam of light, say, depends upon a flame for its existence, right? But these things you might imagine existing simultaneously, not one before the other. He says we can imagine this occurrence being a timeless one, and he thinks we ought to think about the creation of the world in the same way. He says it's not satisfying to give a really long explanation of a chain of cause and effect that goes back a really long time, even forever. Even if we were able to give that kind of explanation, we would have this long chain of cause and effect that itself would need an explanation. And the explanation, he says, would have to come outside of itself. And this is where we get to the conclusion that there must be a God. And so he thinks it's got to be the explanation for the chain has got to either be in itself or outside of itself. He says there's nothing in the world itself that seems to indicate that it can be the explanation of itself. There's nothing in the world's nature that tells us that we should expect the world to be its own cause or its own explanation. He says, quote, "We find nothing about the world or anything in it to suggest that it exists by its own nature. And we do, on the contrary, find ever so many things to suggest that it does not. For in the first place, anything that exists by its very nature must necessarily be eternal and indestructible. And the world is not like that. The world is a finite object." So what's the basic argument here? He says the world and everything in it depends for its existence on something, and an infinite regress of contingent facts is not a sufficient explanation in itself. Even if we did have an infinite regress of contingent facts, that itself doesn't constitute a good explanation. And the world itself doesn't seem to be a necessary being, so there's got to be something outside of the world, and that something is what has traditionally been thought of as God. So I hope you found that explanation helpful.